Hi, welcome back to the PhotoshopTrainingChannel.com. I'm Jesus Ramirez. I'm currently in Los Angeles, California, getting ready for the Adobe Max conference. Photoshop 2020 will be released tomorrow, and in this video, I'm going to show you my favorite features. Make sure that you stick around to the very end of the tutorial because I will show you my favorite feature then. If the tutorial gets a little long for you, then just fast forward to about minute 18 and you'll see my favorite new feature of this release of Photoshop. Okay. Let's get started with the tutorial. One of my favorite new features in Photoshop 2020 is the Object Selection tool. You can find it here in the toolbar. The Quick Selection tool is no longer the default tool. The Object Selection tool works a lot like the Select Subject feature. You might have seen me use this feature before in a lot of my tutorials. The way it works is you can simply click on Select Subject and Photoshop's artificial intelligence uses machine learning technology to make a selection out of the main subject of the image. What the Object Selection tool allows you to do is apply that same command, but you can define the area. So let me deselect and click and drag to select the woman on the left. Notice that the Object Selection tool does a really good job in making that selection. Notice that it missed part of her shoe. You can add to the selection by holding Shift and clicking and dragging to let Photoshop make that selection. You can subtract by holding Alt on Windows, Option on the Mac, and clicking and dragging, and the artificial intelligence will figure out where to deselect from. If you're not getting the appropriate results, you can always come back and continue fine-tuning the selection using any of the other selection tools like the lasso tool. I can hold Shift, click and drag, and add that piece of her shoe back into the selection. From here, I could click on the layer mask icon to remove the background. Photoshop 2020 now has a consistent transform behavior. If you remember in a couple of releases ago, Photoshop changed the way it constrained when you transform. So when you click and drag to transform a selection, you used to have to hold Shift to keep it constrained. You no longer do. Some people didn't like that, and it's understandable. Muscle memory makes you always hit that Shift key, and now when you hit that Shift key, then you distort the image and you don't constrain it proportionately. In the previous release of Photoshop, Adobe added a feature of enabling the old way of doing this. If you press Ctrl-K, Command-K on the Mac, under General, you can see the Use Legacy Free Transform. And you can check that, and then the old way of holding Shift will come back. But I'm going to cancel this because that is not the best way of doing it. Now with Photoshop 2020, when you press Ctrl-T, Command-T to transform, you'll see this chain link icon, and now that chain link icon is tied to that behavior. Notice that this chain link icon is checked, so I can click and drag, and I'm not holding Shift, and the image is constrained. If I disable that, you can click and drag on the corner handle, and now I have to hold Shift to constrain it. So this chain link icon will determine the behavior for the Shift key when transforming layers, and it will affect all layers equally, pixels and vectors. So there's really no need for the checkbox in the Preferences panel. The next feature is a great new addition for people who paint and illustrate in Photoshop. I have the brush tool active. What I'm going to do is adjust my brush. So I'm going to click on the brush settings, and I'll increase the hardness to 100%, reduce the spacing, and I'm just going to click and drag on this point. So now I have a flat brush tip, and I'll reduce the size of my brush. So notice my brush tip now. And the reason that I did this was so that I could show you one of the new features. You now have a keyboard shortcut that allows you to rotate the brush. So notice that when I paint, if I tap on the right arrow key, the brush rotates. See that? It's rotating to the right. Now I'm going to tap on the left arrow key, and it rotates the other way. You can hold Shift and tap on the right arrow key to rotate the brush in larger increments. And obviously the same thing happens when I hold Shift and tap the left arrow key on the keyboard. You probably notice that as I'm rotating the brush, the angle in the brush setting changes. See that? I'm holding Shift and tapping the right arrow key. See how that's rotating? And also in the options bar, we have this new rotation input box. So you can rotate the brush using the angle input box in the brush settings, the angle input box in the options bar, or by using the keyboard shortcut Shift and tapping on the arrow keys, or simply tapping on the arrow keys by themselves without tapping the shift key. The only difference with the shift key is that you rotate in larger increments. And these are not the only new keyboard shortcuts. There's actually one more, the tilde key, which is right below the escape key on the left-hand side of your keyboard in most American keyboards, now acts as an eraser. So when I paint, I can tap on the tilde key and erase. So this is a great way of easily toggling between painting and erasing with the current brush that you have active. Next, we're going to talk about the Zoom to Layer Content keyboard shortcut. It's a keyboard shortcut that I'm sure I'll use a lot. The way this works is that Photoshop can zoom in directly into any content now. What I mean by that is if you hold Alt on Windows, Option on the Mac, and click on the layer thumbnail, Photoshop will zoom right into that particular layer. I can do the same thing on the background layer, and Photoshop will, of course, zoom out. I'm going to duplicate that star, and I'm just going to place it somewhere else in the canvas. And if I select both stars, and I use that same keyboard shortcut, and click once, it'll deselect the second layer, and if I click again, it'll zoom into that second star. So keep in mind that it only works on a single layer or on a group. So if I select these two layers and put them into a group, and then hold Alt on Windows, Option on the Mac, and click on the group icon, Photoshop zooms into those two layers. So remember, this keyboard shortcut works with either one layer or a group. Ever since it was first introduced in Photoshop CS6, the Properties panel has become one of the most important panels in Photoshop. It allows you to select options based on the layer that you have selected. Photoshop 2020 adds significant improvements to this central hub in the editing workflow. With this file, we're going to take a look at the Properties panel. So here I have the Properties panel open. First, with a text layer, you'll notice now that you have all these different hubs: Transform, which you can collapse by clicking on this arrow, Character, Paragraph, Type Options, and Quick Actions. All these hubs give you the power of the Character panel and the Paragraph panel. So now you don't need to open these panels at all. All those settings are found here alongside other settings like the Transformation and Quick Actions. One thing about the transformation is if you make an adjustment, so let me just click and drag to make an adjustment. So I'm just gonna rotate the text and then I'll flip it horizontally. So if you make an adjustment from the panel on the transformation, you can always click on this reset icon to reset that text. And again, I want to reiterate that these are all the same as the properties found in the character panel. Here it is. Notice that if I make a change to one panel, it changes on the other panel. Also, I want you to notice these three dots. If you click on these three dots, you'll expand the panel to reveal more settings. So if you're not finding the setting that you want, make sure that you click on these three dots to reveal more settings. I really like this new feature because all the settings that I need are now found in one single panel. With a pixel layer, you'll get similar features. One of the most important ones, though, is the Quick Actions. In this case, the Quick Actions allows us to apply a select subject command, which, as you probably know by now, is the artificial intelligence that allows you to select the main subject of the image. But there's an even more impressive button, which is the Remove Background button. Let me show you how it works. I'll just deselect, and then I'll simply click on Remove Background. Notice that there is no selection active. When I click on that, Photoshop analyzes the image, it determines what the main subject is, very much like Select Subject, and it applies a layer mask to remove the background. The layer mask is not perfect, but it is really, really good for just one click. This is definitely something that I'm going to be using a lot in Photoshop 2020. And finally, I'm going to quickly point out the background layer. When you select the background layer, you get similar settings. And if you expand the panel and just click off to the side so that no layer is selected, you'll notice that you get document properties in the properties panel. This allows you to adjust the canvas size, change the aspect ratio, change the color mode, and you can also enable your rulers or your grids all within the panel. And in the Quick Actions, you also get options like the Crop, which enables the crop tool, Rotate, which allows you to rotate the canvas, and image size, and trim. These are very useful options that I'm sure that you'll be using a lot in Photoshop 2020. I hope that you like them as much as I do. Let me know down in the comments below what your thoughts are. There's a new file type in Photoshop, a cloud document. The file extension is PSD C. You can look at your cloud documents from this tab in the home screen. A cloud document is simply a Photoshop file that is saved to Adobe's cloud. It saves as you work, and you can access your files from your desktop or your iPad. I'll open up one of my cloud documents, and in the tab, you'll see that there's a little cloud icon indicating that this is a cloud document. If I make a change and close, Photoshop will not ask me to save. That is because it automatically saves onto my cloud. Once I go back into my Cloud Document tab, you can see that this was updated 1 second ago and the changes reflect in the thumbnail. When you create a new document and you save, Photoshop will ask you if you want to save it as a cloud document or on your computer. You can click on the Don't Show Again checkbox and then select one of the options, and Photoshop will remember that selection. Photoshop 2020 gives you a brand new feature with smart objects. You can actually unpack them. In other words, you can convert smart objects into layers. All you have to do is, with your smart object selected, you can just right click on it and select Convert to Layers. Photoshop will let you know that smart filters applied to the smart object will not be retained. You can press OK, and the smart object now gets converted into a group, and inside that group you'll see all the layers that make up that smart object. Photoshop 2020 has a brand new addition in the Content Aware, and it deals with the fill mask. Let me show you how it works. I already have a selection active around this person jumping into the pool, and what I'm going to do is use Content Aware Fill to remove her from the image. So I'm going to go into Edit, Content Aware Fill. By default, Photoshop will select the Auto Sampling Area option. If you don't know what that means, you can just simply hover over the button and Photoshop will tell you. Basically, Photoshop is deciding what pixels to analyze to generate that fill. In green, you will see the pixels that Photoshop selected. You can subtract from what Photoshop decided to select by simply painting over the areas you don't want to sample from. Notice in the preview window, Photoshop does a fantastic job, and I can simply press OK to commit those changes. But before I do that, I simply want to point out that we have more sampling areas. We have rectangle, which simply creates a rectangle around the selection. And we have custom, which allows you to start painting from scratch, and you can paint the areas that you want to sample from. In this case, using auto did a really good job, and then subtracting from the areas that are not similar at all, like those chairs. And notice that again, Photoshop does a fantastic job. Make sure that you output to a new layer and press OK before and after. So it's a very powerful tool and it works great. So make sure that you pay attention to the sampling modes that you use and use the ones that best work for your projects. Another new feature comes with the export window. I have a composite here, and if I wanted to export that, I can go into File, Export, Export As, and this window comes up. And the new feature here is on this 2-up tab. If you click on that, you'll see on the left-hand side the image that you're saving and the original image. I'll zoom in so that you can see how this works. I'll click and drag, and both windows zoom in at the same time. Right now they look identical, but notice what happens when I reduce the quality, and I'll just bring it down to 1% so that you can see the difference. See how this one looks a lot more pixelated and this one does not? This is the original, and this is what the output version would look like. So this window helps you determine what a good quality would be to maintain the original look of your image. Next, we're going to talk about a brand new feature that allows you to close documents much quicker. Notice that I'm working with all these different documents. And if I go into File, you'll see that there is a brand new menu item called Close Others. The keyboard shortcut is Alt-Control-P. That's Option-Command-P on the Mac. And when I click on that, Photoshop will close all other documents except for the one that I currently have active. Now let me show you how this feature works when we have a free floating window. We have a free floating window, and inside of that window we have multiple tabs Then we have tabs that are attached to the actual application frame. If I were to simply go into File and click on Close Others, Photoshop will close all our documents except for the currently active document. But if you right-click on a tab and select Close Others, Photoshop will only close the documents nested onto that tab. So watch what happens. I'll click on Close Others, but it closed all the documents in this free floating window because it was a contextual command, meaning it happened from within this window. Presets have been a part of Photoshop since its very first release almost 30 years ago and have evolved significantly. In Photoshop 2020, we get a huge improvement with presets. Patterns, gradients, shapes, and layer styles now have their own dedicated panels with redesigned presets that can be grouped and easily navigated. Let me show you where they are. You can find them in the panels here, or you can go into Window and find them from the drop down. First, I'll show you the gradients panel. You can see that we have now these groups of gradients. These are all redesigned, and these are the ones that were there previously. And what you can do is click on a gradient to apply it to the currently selected layer. Notice how the gradient was applied to that text layer, and I can just click and it applies it onto the layer. Notice that Photoshop applied a gradient overlay. I can also hold Alt, Option on the Mac, and click and drag one of these gradients and drop it into the Layers panel as a gradient fill layer. On a regular pixel layer, if I just click once on the gradient preset, Photoshop will clip it to the selected layer. I'll press F12 to go back into my original document. That reverts. That's an old feature. That's nothing new. I just needed to go back into my original document. Now let me show you patterns. Patterns work the same way. You can just click once and Photoshop applies a pattern layer style onto a text layer. If you have a pixel layer selected, clicking on a pattern will clip it to that particular layer. If I double click on the pattern to edit it, I can increase the scale. And if I click on a different pattern, Photoshop will apply that pattern and it will retain the same scale adjustment that you applied. You can of course also hold Alt on Windows, Option on the Mac, and click it and drag it into the Layers panel to create a pattern fill layer. Once again, I'll press F12 to reset, and now I'll show you the Layer Styles panel. I'm going to go into Window and select Styles. Here they are. I can just click on any one of these to apply those layer styles to the currently selected layer. All these presets are organized into categories. You can always create a new category or a group by clicking on this icon and placing any preset that you like inside. And now it's time to show you my favorite new feature in Photoshop 2020. I'm going to work with these two layers. I have a white background and this cup. It doesn't have a background and it's a smart object. I'm going to press Ctrl T, Command T to transform, and then I'm going to click on this icon here to enter the warp mode. So the warp mode is a little different. Before you had a 3x3 grid, we can still go back to it from the options bar. I can select 3x3 and there's our grid, and you probably recognize this grid. You can click and drag on these points to transform. And as you can tell, it's already much more powerful than it was. But I'm going to undo that and just show you that you can now have 4x4 grids or 5x5. But the cool thing is you can now go into default and then you can create your grids from scratch. Notice this split icon here, this first one, the split warp crosswide. You will create a horizontal and vertical split. Notice that when I hover over the cup, I can just click and I create my split. Now I can adjust it accordingly with the split that I created. I'm going to undo that. Then I'll show you the vertical split. Here it is. And the horizontal split. So now that I have these splits, I can hold Shift, click and drag, and select multiple points. So I'm holding the Shift key and clicking and dragging. And I'll make sure that this one's selected as well. So I'll hold Shift and click. And I can click and drag all those points at the same time. Best of all, this square now acts as a bounding box. So I can hover just outside of it, click and drag to rotate, and it rotates those points and it distorts the image accordingly. I can also scale. Pretty cool stuff. And I can add more splits if I need to. Notice that as I hover over the image, you can see that the split that I'm going to create follows the contours that we adjusted. So I can come and click on that. then select another split here. And now I can adjust this end accordingly, like so. And maybe I'll adjust the handle as well and just make a larger handle. I'll click on the check mark to commit the changes. Since this is a smart object, we can go back and edit this by pressing Ctrl-T, Command-T to transform, clicking on this icon, and we can continue adjusting the splits. I can also right-click on any one of the splits and select Remove Warp Split, and it removes the distortion, of course. So as you can see, this is a really powerful photo manipulation tool. I'm going to be using it a lot, and I think that you will as well. Let me know down in the comments below what you think of this feature, and also let me know what your favorite feature is. If this is your first time at the Photoshop training channel, then don't forget to click on that subscribe and notification button. Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to you again in the next video.